In the summer of 1944, the Red Cross logistics station on Guam was a place of organized chaos. Stacked crates lined the dusty wooden floors of the makeshift warehouse, each one marked with bold stenciling: medical gauze, penicillin, blankets, and canned peaches. But today, a different shipment had arrived. Lighter, more cheerful in appearance, but no less controversial. Corporal Alan Pierce stood at the loading bay, sweat running down his temples as he inspected a pallet of boxes emblazoned with the unmistakable red and white Coca-Cola logo. Pierce was a junior officer with no real authority but a sharp mind and an instinct for inconsistencies. He was used to tracking shipment logs, signing manifests, and routing supplies to where they were needed most. What caught his attention today was not just the soda brand's presence. Coca-Cola had long been a fixture in military morale packages, but the handwritten notation stamped in red ink on one of the lower shipping forms: POW allocation, Japan Sector, Group 17. He flipped through the attached documents again, double-checking the routing. The shipment was listed under a larger category: civilian morale distribution and medical supplement zones. The additional POW designation had clearly been added later, the handwriting sharp and efficient. That detail gnawed at him. Wounded Marines stationed across various islands were lucky to get 2 bottles a month, often shared among bunkmates. So why was an entire batch being diverted to a Japanese prisoner-of-war camp? Pierce's superior, Lieutenant Bradley Kincaid, was a by-the-book officer with little tolerance for what he called excessive curiosity. When Pierce brought the discrepancy to his attention, Kincaid didn't even look up from his clipboard. "The Geneva boys say we're supposed to show goodwill. Call it optics," he muttered. Kincaid was referring to the Geneva Convention, which mandated fair treatment of prisoners of war, including basic amenities and humane living conditions. Still, Pierce wasn't convinced. In his mind, Coca-Cola was a luxury item. The war had made everything scarce, and morale was currency. Giving it to the enemy seemed unstrategic. "Doesn't make sense, sir." "What if it's seen as fraternizing?" Pierce pressed. Kincaid finally looked at him, his brow tightening. "You want to write a letter to the War Department?" "Be my guest, but that shipment's moving out tomorrow." "Orders stand with that." The conversation ended. Pierce nodded and backed off, but he couldn't shake the unease. He returned to the warehouse and spent the next hour watching the crates get loaded into a covered truck bound for Camp 17, a high-security POW camp located deeper inland on Guam. A handful of Red Cross staff, along with a military escort, would accompany the delivery. Unbeknownst to Pierce or any of the Americans involved, the implications of this shipment were already spiraling in an entirely different direction. Inside Camp 17, the arrival of any foreign object, food, clothing, books, was met with scrutiny and silent dread. Since the early days of their capture, the Japanese soldiers imprisoned here had learned that not every kindness came without strings. Their culture, drilled into them from a young age, emphasized honor, resistance, and suspicion of the enemy's motives. When word reached the barracks that a new delivery was arriving, excitement was minimal. The guards were tight-lipped, as always. But by the afternoon, a truck rolled into the camp's north entrance, drawing the attention of prisoners watching from shaded corners. The truck's tarpaulin flapped in the wind, revealing stacked crates bearing an unfamiliar script: Coca-Cola. A Japanese interpreter stationed at the camp had attempted to translate a hastily scribbled Red Cross memo outlining the distribution, but his English was self-taught, limited to basic terms. He misread a key sentence. Carbonated soft drink for morale became, in his interpretation, chemical soft compound to soften morale. He saw the phrase black liquid, medically approved, and mistook it as evidence of a sedative or obedience formula. When he relayed this to the prisoners, panic quietly rippled through the ranks. Among the first to learn of the bottle's contents was Corporal Nagaoka, a quiet but respected non-commissioned officer who had once worked as a rail inspector in Hiroshima. His bunkmate, Takashi, was a former schoolteacher turned conscript. The two had survived multiple relocation transfers and long bouts of dysentery. Trust was currency in the camp, and suspicion was survival. "They say it's a drink," Takashi murmured as they observed the crates from afar. Nagaoka narrowed his eyes. "We heard it fizz." Some of the younger prisoners had indeed shaken the bottles out of curiosity, hearing the pressurized hiss that followed, but the sound, unfamiliar to most of them, had an eerie quality. "It sounded like something alive," Takashi said. That night, as the guards prepared for rations to be handed out the following morning, rumors bloomed like fungus in the damp corners of the barracks. The Americans were testing a drug. The drink caused mind decay. It was part of a larger experiment to subdue the Empire's warriors without firing a bullet. Others whispered about a story told by an older soldier who claimed he'd read a propaganda leaflet saying Americans experimented with psychological control. What better way to break their spirit than through something that tasted sweet but corrupted the mind? That night, Nagaoka and Takashi sat on the concrete floor, knees tucked to their chests, silent in the humid dark. "Every kindness hides a trap," Nagaoka whispered. Takashi nodded, eyes fixed on the moonlight seeping through the barracks slats. Neither of them touched the bottle that had been delivered to their unit. "They said it was a drink, but we heard it fizz and feared it was alive." Private Teruo Minami was not a soldier by heart. Before the war, he had spent his days counting pills and filling prescriptions in a modest pharmacy nestled between the alleys of Osaka's Umeda district. His father had been a herbalist. His mother taught calligraphy. By the time he was drafted, Teruo had memorized the delicate balance of chemical compounds more than he had any rifle manual. War, to him, was an unnatural prescription, one that no dosage of obedience or loyalty could remedy. When captured during the brutal campaign in the Marianas, Teruo was assigned to Camp 17, a mid-sized POW facility situated on the outskirts of Guam. There, the jungle air mixed with the salt of the Pacific, and behind rows of barbed wire, men like Teruo waited out a war they no longer had any power to influence. Conditions were difficult, but not inhumane. The Americans, under pressure from the Geneva Conventions, made efforts to keep prisoners fed and medically attended, though trust was as scarce as sugar. It was during one of the evening supply drops that the rumors began. A new shipment had arrived, but it wasn't rations or medicine. It was crates of an unfamiliar black liquid in glass bottles, labeled with cursive red script. The guards called it Coca-Cola, laughing as they stacked the bottles carelessly beside standard-issue soap and powdered milk. To the Japanese prisoners, most of whom had never seen carbonated drinks before, it was a mystery. To some, a threat. Teruo, ever observant, watched the reactions unfold like a pharmacist monitoring drug trials. Some prisoners poked at the bottles with sticks. Others sniffed at the caps, wrinkling their noses at the alien sweetness. A few, defiant, tipped the contents into the dirt and returned the bottles empty to the guards with blank expressions. They had been taught that the enemy's kindness often came with strings, and now, after months of war propaganda and battlefield trauma, even a drink was viewed through the lens of suspicion. By moonlight, when most slept or feigned sleep, Teruo took out his notebook, a tattered ledger salvaged from the camp's discarded paperwork, and began to write. Not poetry, not prayers, observations. He described the unease among the men, the whispers that grew louder each day. He called it, quietly and in his own shorthand, the Coca incident. First reactions marked by fear. Some suggest poison, others believe it's a form of obedience drug. One Corporal Nishida said it fizzes like it's alive. No one trusts anything that bubbles without boiling. He buried the notebook in a mess tin under his cot each morning, fearing the guards might confiscate it if found. But each night he added more: descriptions of behavior, drawings of the bottles, even imagined chemical compositions. The sugar content alone baffled him. How could something so sweet be given freely in war? The paranoia spread like fever. Men began hiding their rations. One group behind Barracks 9 dug a pit behind the latrine and buried 12 bottles. Another drained theirs into the sinkhole beside the shower building, splashing the walls to make it appear as though they had drunk it. Compliance without consumption. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., across thousands of miles and endless ocean, naval intelligence was processing intercepted transmissions from Japanese intelligence units. Among them was a particularly unusual message from Japan's 6th Bureau, encrypted in Old Imperial Code and marked with high urgency. It read, "Black nectar corrupts honor. Mind clouding suspected. American tactics shifting." A junior cryptanalyst by the name of Henry Brooks, fresh from Yale and still idealistic about the moral clarity of Allied intentions, found the phrase unsettling. He highlighted it and brought it to his supervisor, a stout, chain-smoking analyst named Captain Desmond Clay. Clay read it, chuckled dryly, and flicked ash onto the document. "Wartime metaphor, kid. They're just mad we're winning the hearts, not just the battles. Move it along." Brooks hesitated, but obeyed. The file was logged, shelved, and forgotten. Back in Guam, the tension was rising. Major Harold Banning, the commanding officer of Camp 17, had received a series of complaints from his guards. The Japanese prisoners were becoming less cooperative, more agitated. They whispered in clusters and fell silent when approached. One sergeant claimed a prisoner had tried to strike him when offered a bottle. Another swore he saw men praying before smashing the glass against a tree. "They're acting like we poisoned them," the sergeant grumbled. Banning, a man who prided himself on order and optics, was concerned. He didn't want trouble on his record, so he requested that a Red Cross inspector stage a demonstration during the next ration delivery, a public tasting to prove the drink's safety. Let them see an American sip it and see that he lived. On December 2nd, the plan was put into motion. The prisoners were gathered into the central yard. Guards lined the perimeter, rifles relaxed but present. A visiting Red Cross inspector, Mr. Glenn Stokes, a jovial man with little grasp of Japanese culture, stood on a makeshift crate with a bottle of Coca-Cola in hand. An interpreter was summoned. Corporal Yamada, a young Nisei soldier with limited field experience. Yamada cleared his throat and spoke into the crowd, intending to say, "This is called Coca-Cola. It is a sweet, safe American drink." But nerves, dialect confusion, and the echo of the open yard twisted his words. Instead, what the crowd heard was, "Koku no Kurosu." A hushed wave moved through the crowd. For those raised in the older dialects, the phrase sounded like "darkness kills" or "blackness will end you." The inspector raised the bottle, smiled, and took a hearty sip. He grinned, wiped his mouth, and gave a thumbs up. But no cheer came. No laughter. Only stiff silence. Eyes narrowed in dread. To the prisoners, the scene confirmed their worst fear. The enemy was so confident in their poison, they would drink it themselves, perhaps immune, perhaps testing their threshold. Teruo stood at the edge of the gathering, clutching his notebook under his shirt. He didn't write that night. Instead, he sat under the eaves of his barracks and watched the moon. If the enemy drinks poison and smiles, how are we to know what's real? POW Camp 17 was a cluster of wooden barracks and makeshift watchtowers carved into a dusty valley on the edge of the Pacific. With war still raging across island chains and headlines bleeding fresh names every week, few in the chain of command cared what happened inside its bamboo fences. The guards, mostly Marines rotated off frontline duty, called it the quiet camp. But quiet did not mean peaceful. It meant smothered. Most of the 1,200 prisoners were boys, barely older than school age, conscripted from rural towns in Hokkaido and Kyushu, and swept into uniform before they could memorize the lyrics to the war songs their officers barked at roll call. They did not understand America, and America did not try to understand them. For months they had obeyed orders to line up, bow, eat, and work. But one thing they did not do, not even under threat of reduced rations or punishment, was drink the American beverage called Coca-Cola. The guards thought it was stubbornness. A few joked that the prisoners were too proud to accept Yankee gifts. Others assumed it was superstition. The truth was more complex, woven from hunger, trauma, and a fear that words could not quite reach. The bottles looked alien, black, slick, and humming with fizz. Rumors said they contained mined drugs. Others claimed they were acidic poisons meant to weaken the soul. The name itself, when whispered among the prisoners, sounded like a ghost story. Coca-Cola. Something sharp in the throat, something that buzzed. In early December 1944, the camp received a new batch of supplies. Among them were several crates of Coca-Cola bottles, still chilled from transport. The guards laughed, hoarded a few for themselves, and left the rest stacked outside the mess tent. One bottle, accidentally or purposefully, ended up beside the dinner tray of a prisoner in solitary confinement. His name was Shiro Kaneda. At 27, he was older than most of the men in Camp 17. Before the war, he had studied civil engineering in Sapporo and helped build irrigation canals in the countryside. He was quiet, not out of fear, but out of a habit learned from cement and blueprints. He was also, according to camp records, insubordinate. 2 weeks earlier, he'd refused to salute during a forced inspection. He was confined to a storage hut, no windows, just a cracked door and a bamboo mat. On the night of December 9th, the door opened. A tray slid in. Rice, miso soup, pickled radish, the usual. But beside it, sweating with condensation, was a single bottle of Coca-Cola. Kaneda stared at it. He had heard the same rumors everyone else had. He had also watched American guards jeer about missing Christmas without Coke. Something about that stayed in his mind. Why would they miss something if it was poison? He touched the glass. Cold. Unnaturally so. He listened. A faint fizz, like river stones under flowing water. Curiosity grew, but it was exhaustion that guided his hand. He pulled the metal cap free using the edge of the food tray. A sharp hiss, then stillness. He waited. No pain, no smoke. Then he brought the bottle to his lips and drank. The sweetness struck him like a festival memory. Not just the sugar, but the way it danced with the bubbles, like biting into a candied apple at a summer fair. For one terrifying moment, he thought he might be hallucinating, that something this sweet could not be real, that his mouth, starved for weeks, was inventing joy. He drank again, then finished the bottle. The next morning, when a young guard delivered his breakfast, Kaneda handed back the empty bottle and said, in halting English, "It tastes like festival candy." The guard blinked, then smirked. He passed the comment along. It became a joke among the Americans. But inside the prisoner huts, where whispers traveled faster than orders, Kaneda's words were not taken lightly. The man in solitary had drunk the poison and lived. That afternoon, 2 prisoners approached a guard during meal service. They pointed to the crate of Coca-Cola and asked softly for a bottle. Their hands trembled as they drank. When nothing happened, they nodded to each other, eyes wide. The next day, 5 more prisoners asked. By week's end, nearly 40. No ceremony marked the shift. No official order made it permissible. But something had changed. And the guards noticed. Reports were written, memos sent. A field psychologist stationed at a neighboring camp visited and took notes. He concluded that Coca-Cola has potential as a soft power morale tool among Japanese captives. He never asked why they hadn't drunk it before. In truth, most of the prisoners still feared the drink, but they feared hunger more, and they trusted Kaneda, not because of rank or training, but because he had been punished. He had endured isolation, and when he returned to the main barracks days later, he did not boast. He simply nodded when asked about the bottle and said, "It was cold." Sweet, and not death. He became a kind of folk hero, a man who tasted the ghost and found it human. The guards chalked it up to progress. The war was turning. Hearts were softening. They celebrated their accidental breakthrough with jokes and slaps on the back. But no one asked the prisoners what had truly changed. No one saw the quiet calculation in their eyes, or heard the murmured question that passed from bunk to bunk. If the drink is safe, what else have we misunderstood? For the Americans, the shift was proof of goodwill. For the Japanese prisoners, it was a lesson in the strange power of the unknown. Sometimes the sweetest taste comes after the longest silence. In the fading heat of August 1944, Staff Sergeant Raymond Doyle was tasked with reorganizing the archives of the 8th Army Procurement Division, stationed temporarily in a makeshift logistics warehouse on Saipan. The war in the Pacific was far from over, but victory seemed closer now, with American forces inching toward Japan. In the chaos of troop movements, supply lists, and Red Cross deliveries, paperwork was constantly misfiled, left behind, or lost in stacks of military bureaucracy. Doyle, a former librarian from Illinois before enlisting, took pride in bringing order to disorder. What he didn't expect was to uncover a document that could have prevented months of confusion and quiet distress. It was a 2-page memo from the International Red Cross, dated March 1944, folded between duplicate inventory reports and unrelated ration statistics. Its title read, Advisory, Distribution of Non-Essential Consumables to Civilians and Prisoners of War in Cross-Cultural Contexts. Below the dense heading was a stark warning. Carbonated beverages, particularly those artificially flavored or colored, may be culturally misinterpreted by populations unfamiliar with such products. Miscommunication and psychological distress may result. A footnote cited cases from North African civilian zones where donated cola drinks had been assumed to be medicinal sedatives or fermented liquids. There, it caused confusion. In prisoner camps, it might do worse. Raymond blinked. He scanned it again. Stamped in faint blue ink at the bottom was the phrase, "For priority distribution to all forward, medical and morale units." He checked the file folder it came from. No indication it had been read, and no routing logs on the back. Someone had stuffed it in the wrong place or decided it wasn't important enough. He took the document to Captain Wesley Trumbull, the quartermaster officer in charge of the division. Trumbull was known for his short fuse and ironclad trust in chain-of-command logic. Raymond explained the potential implications, that Japanese POWs might be reacting out of fear, not defiance, that a cultural misunderstanding could undo months of delicate morale work. Trumbull frowned, read the first paragraph, then tossed the memo onto his cluttered desk. "You want me to call back a whole operation because some Swiss office says soda might be scary? It's Coca-Cola, Sergeant. They love that stuff back home. Makes the camps look humane. Besides, they're drinking it now, aren't they?" Raymond hesitated. "Some are, sir. But not all, and some just pretend to." Trumbull waved a dismissive hand. "Then it's working." Let it be. The memo was never filed again. It disappeared beneath requisition forms and fuel shipment logs, smothered by the weight of a war machine that didn't have time for nuance. Back at Camp 17, the Americans congratulated themselves. They observed small shifts in the prisoners' behavior. Requests for bottles increased. Guards took it as a sign that the psychological barrier had been broken, that kindness and consistency had prevailed over suspicion. The camp commander, Major Harold Banning, even submitted a report to his superiors suggesting the Coca-Cola shipments had been an unexpected success. Initial resistance due to unfamiliarity seems to have passed. Consumption rising steadily. Morale among prisoners appears elevated. But inside the low wooden barracks where shadows stretched long across the dirt floors and the air was thick with unspoken tension, the reality was more complex. Many Japanese prisoners still passed bottles among themselves, unopened. They exchanged polite nods with the guards, sometimes smiling faintly as they held the drink, but behind those expressions was a fog of uncertainty. Was this hospitality, propaganda, or something more sinister? Takashi, a farmer-turned-infantryman from Kumamoto, sat quietly each night beside Corporal Nagaoka, nursing the same bottle he had been handed days ago. He refused to open it, though the heat made him thirsty and the carbonation could have soothed his dry throat. Each time a fellow prisoner popped the cap and sipped cautiously, Takashi winced slightly. He wanted to believe. But belief was a luxury. Trust was even rarer. To taste is not to trust, he whispered one night, barely audible over the rustle of sleeping men. With his toothbrush, he dug a shallow hole beneath his bunk. He placed the bottle inside, wrapped in cloth. It joined a growing cache of unopened sodas buried beneath the barrack floor, a kind of silent protest, or perhaps a shrine to questions that had no safe answers. Another soldier, Yoshinobu Yagi, once a postal clerk in Sapporo, managed to slip a letter out through a contact in the Red Cross. In tiny, careful strokes, he wrote to his younger brother, "We are given a strange drink that tastes like home, but is not from home. Maybe they are trying to teach us how not to hate them." The letter was censored but passed through. It would be weeks before it reached Japan. By then, Yagi had been transferred to a smaller camp in the hills of Luzon. He never saw a bottle of Coca-Cola again. But his words remained, a quiet testimony of doubt and hesitant hope. It wasn't just a drink. It was a question with no answer. In the dust-stained barracks of Camp 11 on the western coast of Tinian, Akira Morimoto adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and quietly reread the latest logistics manifest. A former schoolteacher from Sasebo, he had spent most of his adult life shaping young minds in a classroom where chalk dust settled like fine snow. His specialty had been English literature, Shakespeare, Shelley, and Whitman, recited in the crisp cadence of a man who'd once sat at the feet of American missionaries as a child. Those years near Nagasaki's Christian district had left a permanent mark on him, not just in language, but in nuance. He didn't just speak English, he heard it. Akira had survived the fall of Saipan in July 1944, barely escaping the frontline artillery that thundered through the mountains. Taken into custody with a handful of surrendering administrative staff, he'd been relocated and repurposed as a civilian translator under the command of the U.S. Army's Pacific Logistics Group. The assignment was tolerable. He was fed, clothed, and spared physical abuse. Most days he sorted correspondence between Red Cross envoys and Japanese prisoners. But recently, he had been included in beverage distribution operations, specifically overseeing the doling out of Coca-Cola bottles to Japanese prisoners as part of what the Americans smugly referred to as their hospitality initiative. At first, Akira had assumed the soft drink deliveries were symbolic, harmless tokens of American comfort. But then came the jokes. During a cigarette break outside the mess tent, he overheard two Marines laughing, their voices carrying over the corrugated tin roof. "Bet the Japs think we're poisoning them," said one, flicking ash toward a cracked coconut husk. "They probably think Coke is some kind of brain rot serum," the other replied, laughing harder. Akira stiffened. He felt his throat tighten, the laugh lines on his face flattening into a mask of dread. It wasn't the cruelty of the joke that haunted him. It was the accuracy. He'd seen the way some prisoners flinched when the bottles were placed in their hands. He'd read fragments of intercepted letters from inmates describing a fizzing black potion. He recalled one line from a scribbled message. "It bubbles like it's alive." The next morning, Akira reviewed his upcoming assignment, Camp 17, the same camp where the so-called Coca incident had reportedly caused unrest weeks earlier. That morning, as the deuce-and-a-half truck rumbled toward the compound through fields of elephant grass, Akira rehearsed in his mind how he might explain the drink to the prisoners. Carbonated, sweet, popular with children, associated with festivals in the United States. When he arrived at Camp 17, he immediately approached his American liaison, a broad-chested, sunburnt officer named Lieutenant Ron Halder. Halder had a clipped way of speaking, as if punctuation marks had been left out of his training manual. "I request permission to speak to the prisoners during beverage distribution," Akira said, trying to steady his tone. Halder didn't look up from his clipboard. "Why?" "There is misunderstanding," Akira replied carefully. "Many believe the drink may be harmful. They are frightened. I believe I can help ease tensions," Halder exhaled with exaggerated annoyance. "They're drinking it now, aren't they?" "Some, yes. But I believe the fear is deeper." Cultural Halder finally looked up, his eyes narrowed. "Listen, Morimoto. This program's running smooth now. Last thing I need is you stirring up ghosts. You want to teach, go back to a blackboard. Here, you do what I tell you. Understood?" Akira bowed slightly but said nothing. That afternoon, distribution proceeded as planned. Guards stood flanking the line of thin, sunburnt men as they passed through the supply station. The bottles clinked softly, their dark contents catching the glint of sunlight. Some prisoners accepted them without eye contact. Others hesitated, then moved on without taking one. The tension was there, quiet but palpable. It hung in the air like humidity. Unable to ignore his conscience, Akira made his decision. During a lull between groups, he stepped onto the center platform and called out in clear, formal Japanese. "Brothers, please allow me a moment." Several heads turned. One guard shifted uneasily, his hand drifting toward his sidearm. "This drink, Coca-Cola, is not poison. It is sweet, like summer fruit. The noise it makes is air, not a chemical. It is drunk by children in America. It is meant as kindness." A hush fell over the platform. Some prisoners nodded slowly. Others looked down. One elderly soldier whispered something Akira couldn't hear, but it was not resistance. It was reverence. The moment was brief. 20 minutes later, as crates were being restacked, a junior MP named Brooks approached Halder with a report. "Lieutenant, your translator addressed the Japs without clearance." "Spoke directly to him, sir." Public-like Halder's face turned a shade darker. "Morimoto." That little bastard. By sundown, Akira had been pulled from Camp 17 and reassigned to clerical processing duty at a naval logistics depot, far from any POW site. No explanation was offered. None was needed. Before boarding the outbound transport, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a torn piece of a discarded cigarette carton. With a piece of charcoal from the supply stove, he scribbled his final message. He left it tucked inside a ration crate destined for the prisoner barracks. The paper bore only 7 words. "Trust is not taught through sugar." We feared the drink. But deeper still, we feared why it was given. In May 1945, the war in Europe was drawing to a close. Flags waved across Washington, D.C., but inside the gray-walled chambers of the Office of War Information, the air was sterile and still. Behind heavy oak doors on the 3rd floor, a small theater had been set up for a select group of officers, bureaucrats, and civilian advisors. A new short film, marked Restricted Preview, OI Prop number 38B, was cued on the reel. The title, Hands Across Barbed Wire. The room fell silent as the projector whirred to life. The film opened with sweeping shots of a sunny Pacific island, soundtracked by a hopeful piano melody. American guards stood at ease, smiling beside tidy rows of Japanese prisoners. The POWs saluted respectfully, worked in orderly fields, and laughed at a baseball game. But the centerpiece of the reel was the Coca-Cola scene. In it, a group of young Japanese men in patched uniforms sat beneath a makeshift awning, sipping chilled Coke bottles handed to them by American soldiers. Their faces were relaxed, even joyful. One prisoner wiped his mouth and grinned at the camera. Another raised his bottle in a mock toast as a chorus of English narration rang out, "Even the fiercest enemies can learn to love freedom's taste." Applause broke out when the lights came back on. General Felix Turner of the Psychological Warfare Division leaned back in his seat, nodding to the director beside him. "This," he said, "is the kind of message we need. Humane strength, benevolent superiority, Coca-Cola diplomacy." But one man in the back row didn't clap. He sat stiff, his hands folded tight in his lap, eyes locked on the blank screen that had just displayed a memory-turned lie. Sergeant Alan Pierce had seen that exact row of POWs before, but not like that. Now relegated to clerical duty at Fort Meade due to an old back injury, Alan had been summoned as a logistics consultant for the film's supply chain accuracy. That was the official reason. The real reason was simpler. He had helped process the original shipments of Coca-Cola to the camps in Guam and Saipan. He had flagged the manifest, he had questioned the orders, and he had been told to stand down. What he had seen on the screen was true only in costume. The camp, the crates, the uniforms, they were all real. But the smiles, the drinks raised in gratitude. He remembered it differently. He remembered the silence when the bottles first arrived, the way the prisoners passed them down the rows with suspicious eyes, the bottles buried under bunks, the whispers of "darkness kills" from the mouths of frightened men. And then later, the taste test that changed things, not because of understanding, but because of one man's hunger. Alan remembered that man, too, Shiro Kaneda, the solitary engineer, the one who in his own silent way helped thaw the fear by simply drinking and surviving. Alan had seen his name once on a transfer form. POW number 2117, Status: repatriated. Now, watching the celluloid fiction projected in Washington, Alan's mind drifted to what had never made the real. Not the Red Cross advisory that warned of cultural misinterpretations. Not the reports that some prisoners had assumed the drink was poison. Not the reprimand given to a Japanese interpreter who tried to tell the truth. And certainly not the fact that the entire campaign had, at best, backfired before it was salvaged by narrative manipulation. But America didn't want nuance now. It wanted victory, and with victory came the power to edit the record. Alan quietly excused himself from the room. Across the ocean, in a small fishing village in Kyushu, the sun had already set. Lanterns flickered outside a modest family home where a gathering was underway. The war wasn't over, but the tides had shifted, and many soldiers had begun to return. One of them was Shiro Kaneda. He sat on a tatami mat, legs folded neatly beneath him, his hands resting on his knees. Around him, family members laughed and embraced. A cousin played a shamisen softly near the wall, while Shiro's father poured warm tea into ceramic cups for guests. The scent of grilled eel and rice filled the air. And then one of the younger boys came in carrying a strange glass bottle, brownish-black with English letters and a red and white label. An aid worker had passed it out in town earlier that day. The boy, eager to impress the returned soldier, popped the cap and poured the fizzy liquid into a chipped glass before placing it in front of Shiro. For a long time, Shiro didn't move. He stared at the bubbles rising. The soft hiss of carbonation sounded like distant rain. He could still hear the Americans laughing about missing Christmas without Coke. He could still feel the hunger that had led him to take that first sip. Back in Camp 17, the taste had reminded him of festival candy. Sweet but confusing. Unfamiliar but not unpleasant. But what had stayed with him was not the flavor, but the reaction of the men around him, how his smile, faint and bewildered, had caused the line of fear to break just slightly. Now, in this quiet room thousands of miles from that camp, Shiro reached for the glass. He held it for a moment, tilted it slightly, watched the bubbles drift like smoke beneath the surface. Around him, the family watched silently, unsure what to expect. Finally, he raised it to his lips and drank. He smiled faintly, the same way he had that winter day beside the rice tray. It was never about the drink. It was about what they needed us to believe it meant. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of curiosity, cultural discovery, and the surprising moments of humanity that can emerge even in times of war. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire understanding, empathy, and appreciation across cultures.